Hi, sixth graders. It's Miss Munis again for day 4 of Supporting Details. Last time we talked about Lewis Braille and the Braille system of the alphabet for writing, for writing and reading for people that are blind. And that was to talk about articles without subheadings. I gave you the homework to read the article about group behavior that also did not have subheadings. I'm going to tell you some of the supporting details that I pulled from that to talk more about group behavior. It talked about group behavior in terms of sociology, was one of the big vocab words that it talked about, and sociologists, some of our experts, right, scientists that study group behavior, that study the behavior of humans in groups as well. Call that study of sociology, right? So it talks about at the beginning of the article how group behavior kind of started out, right, when man was more primitive, when humans were more early on, they were kind of living in caves, right, and moving around, hunting, gathering, things like that. So it talked about how it became apparent to primitive humans that working together and working in groups made it more successful and more effective for their survival and to get more food and hunting and things like that. So they became aware that working together and working in groups, group behavior, made it possible to be more successful in surviving. It talks about also about how there's companionship in groups, right? It can be a lot very beneficial for our mental health as well. That's not necessarily in the article, but it can be good for our mental health to be talking to other people. But then it really gets into kind of the meat of our article here, right? It talks about the specific behaviors that we have. We have roles in our group, right? You might be a daughter or a son of someone. You might be a granddaughter or a grandson to someone, a niece or a nephew. You might be a sibling, a brother or sister. You could be an older brother or sister. You could be a younger brother or sister. You could be someone that helps out around the house a lot with chores. You could be someone who helps around with younger siblings or maybe a pet, right? So you have different roles that you play within your household and then also within the community, right? Think about maybe yourself as a student. You play a role in the classroom. You might play a role on a sports team. You might play a role in a theater group or an arts group that you do. You might play a role in different activities that you play or even around your neighborhood, right? Maybe you're a leader in your peer group. Maybe you're the youngest sibling, so you might not be a leader supposedly in your family, but in your peer group outside in the neighborhood or at school, you might be a leader to your friends or in the classroom, right? So there's lots of roles that we can play. It talked about how we have norms and values in groups, right? We talk about that a lot actually at school, right? It talked about how we might have certain times we wake up, certain times we do things, especially when we're in school normally, right? When you go to school, you have to wake up at a certain time to get on the bus or to have someone take you to school. There's a bell schedule. There's expectations that teachers might have as a classroom, right? You might have certain rules in a science classroom if you're doing a lab that are different than if you're in an English classroom and you're doing reading groups, right? Or different from a PE class where you're moving around more. So there's different rules, right, that we adhere to as a community, as a group, as a school, as families, right? A lot of families have a lot of different norms and values as well. Your family might like to get up early and go on walks or go outside every weekend. Or maybe your family likes to sleep in and you spend a lot of time playing games inside together or doing different things. There's lots of different ways that families like to have norms and values, and no one is better than the other, but there's just different ways that we learn and grow and interact with each other, right? And then it talks about how there can be some downsides to group behavior, right? Sometimes we do see these in schools as well. It talks about how some group members might feel rejected or might be rejected. Sometimes in schools, we talk a lot about getting rid of bullying and trying to get rid of bullying that way so that we don't have friends or peers or classmates or anyone that feels rejected or that feels like an outsider, right? Because we're trying to build that community. We're trying to build those group norms and group behavior. It also talks about how there can sometimes be a common enemy that, one group really doesn't like another group. So you have a common enemy. They talk about that as well as a negative, right? Those are some supporting details that scientists look at, that sociologists look at in group behavior. They look at the norms and values of different groups, and they look at the roles that groups have. And they might look as well at, with roles, they might look at companionship as well. Those kind of go along with roles on how we interact with each other. Scientists, again, it says, look at that to see how and why we form these groups, right? So that was the article Group Behavior that you guys worked on for homework, I hope. Today, we are going to kind of transition back into the ancient world, and we're going to talk about King Tut. We're going to look at an article called Where Did King Tut Get His Eyebrows? Eyebrows. That sounds interesting, right? I want you to think about, as I'm loading the present screen, think about what you know about King Tut. Have you heard his name before? You know, where is he from maybe? What could we be talking about with his eyebrows, right? So King Tut. Where did King Tut get his eyebrows? This is a longer article. As you can see, it's a longer article that we're going to be looking at today. But I promise it's very interesting. And I also have another interesting article for you as well about another major figure for homework, Muhammad Ali. So I hope that you enjoy these. We're going to start with King Tut, though, to talk again about articles. As you see, again, we don't have any subheadings here, right? So we don't have any subheadings in this article. But when we look at, again, the title here, where did King Tut get his eyebrows? Some key words that jump out to me are where, right? Maybe it's going to talk about location. And then the other part is eyebrows. Are they talking about like my physical eyebrows on my face? Because don't those just grow kind of when you're born, or they're just there, right? So what does it mean when it talks about where did King Tut get his eyebrows? And why King Tut? Why not just where do humans get their eyebrows, right? Why are we specifically talking about this person, King Tut? All right, so I want you to take a moment, or go ahead and pause the video, and it'll take a little longer, to either listen. Again, you can click at the top and it'll read it to you and you can follow along, so listen along, or go ahead and read it to yourself. I would like you to read the article, Where Did King Tut Get His Eyebrows? Go ahead and pause the video, and then when you're ready, you can unpause it, and I will start talking about the article with you, Where Did King Tut Get His Eyebrows? All right, so hopefully you are unpausing this now, and you are ready to talk about and discuss, excuse me, you're ready to talk about and discuss where did King Tut get his eyebrows and some of the supporting details on this, all right? So the first thing I noticed about this article is it's giving us a lot of background on who King Tut is and how we came to know about him, right? It talks about how in 1922, there was this archaeologist, Howard Carter, who found King Tut's tomb after 3,000 years of no one seeing it or being inside of it. You know, it wasn't raided by tomb raiders. It wasn't raided by thieves. So everything was in there. They found so many artifacts in there. And King Tut, or King Tutankhamun is his full name, Tutankhamun, in his tomb, right? They found sculptures, they found gold, they found chariots. They said they even found flowers that disintegrated once they touched air, but they found flowers that had been picked at that time, 5 centuries earlier. That's over 500 years. That's insane, right? It gives us also a little bit of background about King Tut, or King Tutankhamun himself, right? It said that he was really young, only 8 or 9 when he became king. And he also passed away really early. They don't know why exactly, but he passed away very early. They then started to talk about how he was mummified. He was made into a mummy, which was very traditional for ancient Egyptians back then. Maybe you've heard about mummies or seen pictures of them. And they were buried in a sarcophagus inside a tomb, which is kind of like, it almost looks like a human body kind of sarcophagus. And then there's a mask that they found of the sarcophagus that sits over top of where your face would be. And it has over 24 pounds of solid gold. Can you imagine that much gold put into a mask for someone? Right? So it was how they have this huge kind of amount of reverence and attention to detail for people that have passed away in their society, right? So they talk about how this tomb and this tomb of King Tut and the sarcophagus and mummy is so special and so revered and talked about because they had never found a pharaoh's tomb. A pharaoh is, again, a king of ancient Egypt. They never found one that had been so well preserved, right? They've always been kind of looted or stolen from or thieved, right? So they hadn't been able to find them. So the thing that they're going to then specifically talk about and that is going to give us supporting details for where did King Tut get his eyebrows, our main idea, is that it starts talking about the mask about halfway through the article, which is really what we're going to look at for our supporting details, right? Because yeah, it's great to know about the background of King Tut, and we have to know that in order to know why are we even talking about his eyebrows, right? So we have to know a little bit about the mummification and why it was so important to find King Tut's tomb and the fact that it had never been touched before, right? But for over 3,000 years. So we're now going to get into why his mask and his eyebrows are so important, or why they're so interesting, right? So it starts about halfway through the article. It says, of all the features of the mask, perhaps the most interesting are the pharaoh's eyebrows, right? So now we know they're not talking about the eyebrows on the face. They're talking about eyebrows on this mask of the sarcophagus. They're thick arches of bright blue, matching the stripes of the headdress, but it's one of the rarest substances of the ancient world, a stone called Lapis Lazuli, right? So then it's going to start talking about the history of that stone, which tells us more, right? So now we know that the eyebrows, I wrote down that the eyebrows are Lapis Lazuli. I'm going to write that down now because that is clearly what we are going to be talking about, right? Because if we're talking about where and eyebrows, right? So this time I'm not even going to write down the whole title. I'm just going to write down where and eyebrows because those are our key points here, right? So we talk about here, it talks about the eyebrows of the sarcophagus, right? Because we're not talking about his eyebrows on his face. So eyebrows of mask or sarcophagus mask, and that it's made from this stone called Lapis Lazuli. This blue stone called Lapis Lazuli that it says was very rare, one of the rarest substances of the ancient world. So we know it's probably a really special stone. So let's look at where this stone is found, right? So then it talks about how ancient Egyptians were excellent traders, right? They sent caravans over the desert, they sent caravans over boats in the sea, and they just traveled around a lot to exchange a lot of materials. They traded, it talks about papyrus, an early form of paper, and they traded grain. It talks about where they trade these to. This is going to be a supporting detail, right? So they're traders, ancient Egyptians. So I'm going to write down Egyptians equal traders. All right, so I wrote down Egyptians equal traders on my paper. I'm going to write down that they traded wood, they traded for wood, they traded for copper, and they traded for incense, which is like a scent. A lot of times, like we talk about essential oils now, incense is something that you would burn to release some scents. So they traded for that. They traded in places like Lebanon, Cyprus, the kingdom of Punt, or Punt, as they say in the article. And they say that of all of these goods that were coveted by the really wealthy and the powerful people in Egypt, what was really, really coveted and desired was this blue stone called Lapis Lazuli, because it was so rich and blue that they named it kind of the sky stone, because it reminded them of the sky. And it even had the appearance of being flecked with what looked like gold. So it was really coveted. But it talks about how it was really, really hard to get this, right? So we talked about how the Egyptians are traders and they travel by boat, they travel over deserts to get all these different valuable materials. Now we're going to learn about where the lapis lazuli comes from. And we have that in the next paragraph, that it's from the northeast of what is today Afghanistan. So it's from the northeast of northeast Afghanistan. I'm going to write that down, is where it's from. which is a very, very mountainous country, right? So it's saying it has rugged terrain. It's saying that there's lots of mountains that you have to overcome, right? So think about it. Back then, they didn't have planes, they didn't have cars or things like that to get through the mountains. They would have had to walk or ride like horses or camels or different type of donkeys or different types of things to get to wherever they were going. So they would have had to really travel through that. Not only that, but they'd have to mine by hand the rocks and stuff, right? So it's saying it was difficult to get these stones out, these Lapis Lazuli stones out once they were mined. And then it was difficult, again, to get them over this mountainous terrain in Afghanistan or modern day Afghanistan, right? But because they were so valuable, traders would risk this to make it to the market, right? They would get a big return on it. All right. Then it talks about two trade routes, that there are two main trade routes. Two trade routes, right? Because now we are talking about how they got the eyebrows or the stones for the eyebrows back, right? So we now are traveling from northeast Afghanistan to along either of these two trade routes. The northern route, which went across the upper border of what is today Iran, and then the southern route that began on the Helmand River, it said, and then went through ancient Mesopotamia. Again, it talks about here that traders had to cover over 2,000 miles to get these stones from what is now Afghanistan to Egypt, right? So that's over 2,000 miles in the ancient world without cars, without modern technology, without modern transportation. That's a really difficult journey today, but it's also even more difficult back then because they wouldn't have modern transportation. Then we talk about, in this article, we talked about where it came from now, right? We talked about where it came from. 2,000-mile travel to Egypt from northern Afghanistan. We talked about why and how they got it from there, right? That the Egyptians are really good traders, that they were traveling by pretty much all means available to them and necessary to get these stones. But they were saying that it's so rare that even though they used it in different sacred symbols and different offerings, that it was really only used by people that had a lot of wealth or a lot of power in ancient Egypt, which is why it would make sense that one of their kings or one of their pharaohs would have it in their headdress, just like King Tut or King Tutankhamun had it in his headdress on the eyebrows. But it says that because this material was so rare, they couldn't use it on all the headdress around the edge, around like where his hair would be. They instead used an imitation piece or a fake, less expensive kind of stone or paint to put that on because it was so rare they could only use it for the eyebrows, right? So it's saying that they were pulled from the earth in Afghanistan. They traveled this trade route that was treacherous because of the mountains, and it's a really valuable substance, probably warding off thieves. And then they were so sacred that they were used in this king's mask, right? Only as the eyebrows. They couldn't even put it all the way around. It was only used in the eyebrows. So now we have those supporting details that the eyebrows of the mask, right? We're talking about the eyebrows of the mask. There was a stone called Lapis Lazuli, one of the rarest of the ancient world and most coveted. Ancient Egyptians were excellent traders, which is how they came to acquire this stone from northeast Afghanistan, or what is now northeast Afghanistan. And that there were two major trade routes, right? They had the northern and the southern trade route. And even along both those trade routes, it was still over 2,000 miles for this stone to have traveled to make it to this mask and to make it to Egypt. All right, so those are our supporting details that I wrote down. For your homework, I would like you to look at the article, The Importance of Muhammad Ali. We're talking about another major person in history. This time, this person is from the US. So you're gonna learn a lot about Muhammad Ali here. Again, it's a little bit of a longer article, so you might need to spend a little more time on it. But I promise it's really interesting, and it gives you a lot of kind of cool information about someone who's from the US. Again, I want you to look for, going to stop presenting. There we go. I want you to look for things that relate to the title, right? So why is Muhammad Ali important, right? The importance of Muhammad Ali is our title. So it must be an abridged. Abridged means it's a shortened version. So this piece was probably taken from a longer essay or a longer book that the author here or the editor has shortened so that it's more condensed and easier for us to read, and we get more of the just important information quicker. So maybe find at least 3 to 5 things that are some things that are important about Muhammad Ali. Why is he important to the US? Why is he important to the world, right? So I want you to look for 3 to 5 things that support that he is important, right? Because that's what the supporting details would have to support for the title. I hope that you enjoyed the King Tut article today. If you found it interesting, I would encourage you to go and do some more research on ancient Egypt or King Tut himself. There's a lot of cool information out there about it, about sarcophagus and mummies and mummification process. It's a lot of really cool information. So I hope that you enjoy that, and I hope you enjoy the Muhammad Ali article. If you would like an extension activity, I would encourage you to look up maybe another famous person that you find inspiring or that you find important, and to look up some information about them. That's what I would encourage you to do. Again, you can look that up on ReadWorks, and you can read more about different people on ReadWorks, or you can look at some of the other sites that we have on RPS as well. There's a lot of great sites for you to look at. Common Lit is a great one. 6thELA is another great one that'll have a lot of people you can look at and research. So I hope that you enjoyed learning about King Tut today, and I hope you enjoy reading about Muhammad Ali. Look forward to working with you tomorrow.